Practice 3.2, we're going to be looking at cardiorespiratory endurance. So some information you don't really have to like memorize or anything like that, but just give you some context. Is in your body, you have about 4 to 5 liters of blood, and that'd be for a 150-pound person. So again, if you're more than that, you would have a little bit more blood. But to kind of put that in perspective, 1 liter of water weighs 1 kilo or 2.2 pounds. So in your body, you probably have more than 12 pounds of blood circulating in your body right now. And that blood circulating in your body, about 16% is always in your lungs. And about 2/3 of your blood is just hanging out in your veins. So it's more carbon dioxide rich. And if you look at the makeup of your blood, about half of it is plasma, just kind of the fluid. So that means the other part is hematocrit, or the solid stuff. And men typically have a significant more amount of hematocrit. That means there's more red blood cells, so there's more oxygen delivery to moving muscles. So just to review part of the heart, the circulation of the heart. Up here we have the 2 atria, or atrium. They always receive blood. And down here we have the 2 ventricles. They receive blood from the atria. If you look, we have the right side and the left side. Again, that's oriented in the person. So if you look at the left ventricle, that is much thicker. And that is because the left ventricle has to pump or squeeze or contract with enough force to overcome gravity. And it has to pump blood pretty much from your head to your toes. So whereas the right ventricle really only has to pump it from your heart to your lungs. So we're going to be talking about the left ventricle in particular when we talk about the cardiorespiratory fitness. So again, the pathway, right, deoxygenated blood comes from the body into the right atrium. Then we have a contraction, and then it opens up this valve, goes to the right ventricle. Those valves close, the right ventricle contracts, opens up this valve, and then goes to your lungs, right? Because of pressure, carbon dioxide gets released into the air, and oxygen enters our lungs. That oxygenated blood comes into the left atrium. Another contraction, right? Opens up this valve into the left ventricle, and then pumps throughout the body. So that looped up, the heartbeat we hear, that's actually the coordinated closing of those valves. So when our heart beats, right, we feel a pulse. And when our heart beats, that pulse, we have a kind of bolus, or this kind of movement of blood through that blood vessel. And during that movement, there's higher pressure. And we measure blood pressure by millimeters of mercury. And that higher pressure is called the systolic pressure. And then that time between each heartbeat is when those blood vessels relax, and that's the diastolic pressure. So blood moves right away from the heart into the body, and it goes through arteries, through smaller and smaller arterioles, until it gets to capillaries. And through the capillaries and through the gaps in the capillaries, nutrients and oxygen and gases and carbon dioxide get passed through those membranes. And then that deoxygenated blood returns back to the heart through the veins. If we look at the lungs, the pulmonary system, the lungs, right? We take a deep breath, and oxygen enters gets warmed up through our nasal cavity. It traps any particles through our mucus in our mouth and lungs. And then it really goes down into the alveoli. Now these are like little air sacs, and this is like the functional part of the lung. So this is where you can see capillaries are just totally surrounding each alveoli. And that's where the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, pass through those cell membranes so we can inhale and exhale those gases. And then in the circulatory system, those red blood cells pick up oxygen from the air and they release the carbon dioxide from the body. And then it's going to, those red blood cells will carry the oxygen to moving muscles. And then within the blood, within the plasma and whatnot, there's going to be other nutrients that the body needs for fuel, right? Primarily a sugar, glycogen, and maybe a little bit of fat as a triglyceride. There's other enzymes that help transport, carry, and break down those nutrients. So if you look at the muscle, right, the muscles are really surrounded with a bunch of fluid. And in that fluid, those nutrients come through and different organelles, different parts of the muscle cell pick up and use those nutrients. And then they release the byproducts back into the blood, and then that carries it back to the heart. So we really need this efficient cardiorespiratory system to deliver oxygen and nutrients when it's demanded, and then to process and to expel it when it's not needed. So in each muscle cell, with most cells except for red blood cells, have a way to make or process energy. And that energy processor in the cell is the mitochondria. And within that mitochondria, it uses nutrients like glycogen, sugar, and oxygen to create energy. And that energy referred to as adenosine triphosphate. And we have to break those bonds, right, to create energy. And that's how your muscles contract. That's the fuel. That's the cash the body needs for energy. So we really need that from oxygen and glycogen. So if we have aerobic exercise, that means there's enough oxygen coming in to meet the muscle's needs. With one glycogen and some air, some oxygen, we can create 32 to 34 ATP units, which is a lot of energy. If it's anaerobic without oxygen, it means our muscles are working faster than the oxygen can be delivered. That same glycogen molecule only creates 4 ATP and then a byproduct, lactic acid. So less efficient, but a much faster process without oxygen. So there's something called the Bohr Effect when we talk about this process of how our body uses oxygen to create energy. So I'm going to transition to my paper and try to explain the Bohr Effect in a way that we can understand. The Bohr Effect, on the x-axis, we have the pressure of oxygen in the tissue measured in millimeters of mercury, right? And this is in tissue, right? And over here on the y-axis, we have the oxygen content. All right. So in the air, again, you don't necessarily have to memorize or know these numbers, but just to kind of show that pressure moves from high to low. So in the air we breathe, right, we have about 155.8 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. Now once that enters the lungs, that drops down to about 104 millimeters of mercury. And then, right, that goes from the lungs to that the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, and then it gets pumped out of that pulmonary artery. That's that main artery that comes out of the top, the aorta. So right there we have, kind of in the aorta, we have about just under 100 millimeters of mercury. So we can see this shift kind of goes like this. And then if we look down kind of in our body, in the capillaries, we have about 45 millimeters of mercury. And then by the time it gets to the mitochondria in those muscles, let's say this is your quadricep, we're down to about 40 millimeters of mercury. So this blue is going to represent kind of the air at rest. And then, so if we're active, our muscles still need that same oxygen content. But what happens is there's a shift in that pressure in the tissue. So, right, there's really not much shift in the lungs and in the heart. But then once we get in the body, there's this shift here. So perhaps like the more intense the activity, there's probably a sharper shift. So you can see here, these numbers don't change if we look at it this way. We're still at 40 millimeters here. We're still at 40 millimeters of mercury there. But what happens is the pressure within the tissue changes. And what happens then is we have an increase in carbon dioxide buildup back up. What that does is there becomes a shift in the pH content, which makes the blood more acidic, which then basically increases the demand for oxygen, right? So this can really only happen to a limit before really the demand won't meet the supply. So hopefully that kind of helps like show exactly kind of what's going on inside your muscles and inside your body with this oxygen demand and how it's delivered. So as your body becomes more efficient at delivering oxygen, removing carbon dioxide, and managing that lactic acid or the acidity in the blood, our body can increase its stroke volume. So basically a stroke volume is how much blood your left ventricle can pump out per squeeze. So a couple things that happen as we exercise aerobically is the volume of this left ventricle increases. The walls of that left ventricle become stronger. They become more elastic. So when it contracts and it refills, there's more rebound in there. So you kind of think of a basketball that's pumped up. It has more rebound than when it's flat. It kind of doesn't. So kind of think of that how the blood is expelled from the heart as well. So, right, for aerobic exercises, we're interested in that stroke volume, how much blood that heart can pump out. So typically the higher the stroke volume, the lower the resting heart rate, because that heart can do more work with less effort. So we'll pick up here on the next video.